Dr. Howard C. Estep is now ready to begin teaching his 30th message from the book of Genesis, starting with chapter 32, verse 13.
Turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis, chapter 32, beginning in verse 13. Our lesson will take us through chapter 33, verse 20, and then this will give us a good understanding of this section of Scripture as we've been studying week by week in a verse-by-verse manner, the book of Genesis. We have a lesson outlined for you as we conclude the last part of chapter 32. Number 1, a present for Esau. That's verses 13 through 23. That's in chapter 32. Number 2, Jacob's famous wrestling match, verses 24 through 32. And that concludes chapter 32. And then we move into chapter 33. 1, reconciliation of Jacob and Esau effected, verses 1 through 16. You'll remember Jacob left town 20 years previously, and now he's coming back to the land of Canaan to see his long lost brother that he hasn't laid eyes on for over 20 years. And that's our first part in chapter 33, the reconciliation of two brothers, verses 1 through 16. And number 2, Jacob settles in Canaan, verses 17 through 20. So now we move into our lesson in chapter 32, beginning in verse 13. And we have there a present for Esau. Why would he give a present for Esau? Well, Jacob has been gone for 20 years, and now he's coming back to Canaan, and he left town because his brother had threatened to kill him. As you remember in previous lessons, the brother said, I'm going to kill him. Why? Because Jacob finagled Esau out of his birthright. It was legally and rightfully the birthright of Esau, but Jacob's mother finagled Jacob because she loved Jacob more than Esau. She finagled Jacob to get the birthright from Esau. So when Esau saw that he had been a victim of crooked dealings, he said, I'm going to kill him. So the mother said, the best thing for you to do, son, is to pack up and get out of town. Hightail it across country, which he did. And he was gone for 20 years. In the meantime, he married 2 women, 2 sisters, and he also fathered children by 2 other women. And he comes back now at the end of 20 years, and he has a lot of cattle, a lot of sheep, a lot of goats, a lot of children, a lot of responsibilities, a lot of problems. And so he's coming back now to meet the brother who said, I'm going to kill him. So what's he going to do? Well, he's going to give him a gift. He sent messengers ahead to meet Esau to see what Esau's reaction was going to be. And so now Jacob sends a present to Esau, and that's where our lesson begins at this time in verse 13. And he lodged there that same night, and took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother. Because as Jacob has been gone for 20 years, he has become the recipient, as he worked for his uncle Laban, he has been the recipient of cattle and goats and sheep, so forth. So he has picked out some of those animals, and he's going to give them to his long-lost brother. Verse 14, what? 200 she-goats and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams. That's a lot of animals, isn't it? Let's read that again and see if I haven't made a mistake. Now he's given his brother a present. He's been gone for 20 years. 14, 200 she-goats, 20 he-goats, 200 ewes, and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 she-asses and 10 foals. That's almost a stockyard, isn't it? You'd think he was running a stockyard down there in that part of what we now call the state of Israel. He's just going to give this to his brother. Now, evidently, he had much more than this, because he's willing to part with all of that. And years ago, when this was computed, the value, back 25, 30 years ago, someone computed the value of all of these animals, And at that time, it was about $25,000. Today's market, I would say what he was giving Esau in the way of these animals on today's market would run probably $100,000 because meat is up. I went through farmer's market 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks ago. Wife and I were down in L.A., and I always like to go through farmer's market. It's quite a place. It's the corner of 3rd and Fairfax. It's much like a carnival. And they have every kind of food that you can think of in the world. And my doctor said, well, you should eat lots of veal. And I said, well, veal, that's a young calf. And so I said to my wife, let's see what veal is. So we went by a meat counter, looked in, and you know what veal was selling? That was almost 8 weeks ago. Veal was $35 a pound. I said, well, I quit eating veal right there, you know. That washed me out right there. So here's this fellow's going to give his brother about $100,000 worth of animals. Let's move on to verse 16. And he delivered them into the hand of his servants, every drove by themselves. He had them all segregated, every drove by themselves, and said unto his servants, pass over before me. In other words, you go in front of me. Take all of these animals, and you go in front of me, and I'll be behind you. This is what he's saying when he says, pass over before me. You go in front of me with all of these animals, and put a space betwixt drove and drove. So you can see that the she-goats would be in one group, and here would come the 20 he-goats, and then the 200 ewe lambs, and then another group would be the 20 rams. And then behind that would come the 20 milk camels with their colts, and then he would have 40 cows coming behind that, and then 10 bulls would be coming behind that, and then 20 she-asses, and 10 foals. It looked like a parade, like a farmer's parade going on. And he's been coming from the south country. Now he's entering into Canaan with his whole mass of animals. At our day's price, estimated about $100,000 worth of animals on the hoof. Now it's rather interesting, but note what happens when Esau saw all of this. This is verse 17. And he commanded the foremost, saying, when Esau my brother meeteth thee, and asketh thee, saying, whose art thou? Because naturally Esau is going to be disturbed when he sees all of these animals coming into his area, because they're going to eat up all the pasture. They're going to wipe him out. He won't have pasture for his animals. Because evidently God has been blessing Esau as well as he's been blessing Jacob, because God originally made the promise to Abraham, you know, that I'm going to bless you and your posterity after you. So Esau is Abraham's posterity. He's the son of Isaac. And Jacob is Abraham's posterity. He's also a son of Isaac. So evidently God has been blessing Esau the same as he has been blessing Jacob. So naturally Esau is going to be disturbed when he sees this fantastic grove of animals coming into his area, because they're going to eat up all of his pasture. Now notice what happens. We're in the middle of verse 17. When Esau my brother meeteth thee, and asketh thee, saying, whose art thou, and whither goest thou, and whose are these before thee? When my brother asks, where did all these come from? Who do they belong to? What do you have in mind? What are you going to do with all these animals? Verse 18. Then thou shalt say, they be thy servant Jacob's. These animals belong to Jacob. In other words, Jacob is trying to impress his brother that he has been tremendously wealthy. He has been very fortunate. He's just been so fortunate in his business dealings that God has blessed him with tremendous herds of animals. And so he says, whenever they ask who they are, you just tell them that these be thy servant Jacob's. It is a present sent unto my lord Esau. I'm going to give him a present. It's a present. And behold, also he is behind us. So he sent the animals on ahead. The animals are going to be much like your calling card. When you call as a salesman in an office, the first thing you get out is your card. Jacob has his calling card out front, all these animals, you see. And so Jacob says, whenever Esau sees all of this, you tell him whose they are, and he says, I'll be right behind. Because he's afraid to go back, really. He doesn't know what his brother Esau is going to do. He's a little bit skittish, you know. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and he's not trigger happy, but he's sure got, he's got rabbit feet in his shoes, and he could take off in the other direction real quick if he had to. So note what happens. Rather interesting. It is a present sent unto my lord Esau, and behold, also he is behind us, 19. And so commanded he the second and the third, and all that followed the drove, saying, on this manner shall you speak unto Esau when you find him. In other words, when all of these animals come by, much like a parade, and they're all segregated into different groups, when they go by, you just say to Esau, this is a present from your brother Jacob. Verse 20. And say ye moreover, behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goeth before me. And afterward I will see his face, peradventure he will accept of me. So what he's doing here, this was a princely present and more than enough to repay Esau for any wrong done unto him. Jacob realized that he had wronged his brother, and so he's willing to invest $100,000 in livestock to smooth over the ill feeling between his brother Esau and himself. And so he's willing to do that according to verse 20, because he says, peradventure he will accept of me. If he accepts this gift, then everything will be all right. So went the present over before him, and himself lodged that night in the company. Jacob lodged in the midst of all of these animals and his people and so forth that night, because next morning's going to be the big deal. Verse 22. And he rose up that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 women servants. These are the 2 women with whom he had had children in the years when his women were not bearing children, and his 11 sons, and passed over the fork, or over the river, or over the stream of water called Jabbok. Jabbok, a stream 65 miles long. It begins in the Hurain Mountains and empties into Jordan about 30 miles below Lake Galilee. It was the boundary line between the kingdoms of Shion and Og in Joshua chapter 12. Afterwards, it was the boundary between Reuben and Manasseh. So we find him next morning going real quickly with his wives and children and going to a little village called Jabbok. Verse 23, and he took them and sent them over the brook, and sent over that he had. So now he's moving into the land that he grew up as a young man, because he left town roughly 20 years ago. Now he's come back a very wealthy man. So we have here a present for Esau. And what he's trying to do, he's playing domestic politics. He's trying to settle the family differences. Now we see something very interesting that we've heard about all of our life in Sunday school. And we have Jacob's famous wrestling match. This is in verses 24 through 32. And verse 24 says, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. He's all alone for some reason or other. It doesn't say just exactly clear why. But he wrestled with a man. He's wrestling with God all night long. Now, I don't think that he wrestled all night with God, because that isn't actually the inference. Here it refers to actual bodily wrestling, proving that God has a body and can be seen and felt and handled and touched bodily like a man or an angel. And evidently, after he awakened from his sleep, he wrestled with God. I don't think that he wrestled from sundown to sunup, 12 hours. I don't think That's the problem at all. It's after he had awakened from his night's sleep. Then God came to him and they got involved in a discussion in the famous wrestling match. We move to verse 25. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, when Jacob saw that he was losing, that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. God touched the thigh of Jacob, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, and he wrestled with him. If you've ever had your hip out, I don't know whether you have or not. I'm trusting that you have, so you'll get my illustration. If you have, you don't want it anymore. But if you ever get your hip out, you can't get up or down. You can't bend over. It really hurts. So God touched him here in the socket of the hip, and he had tremendous pain. God touched him, gave him a whack, evidently. Some reason or other, God touched his hip, and his thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with God during that encounter that night. We move to verse 26, and he said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." In other words, it's coming daylight. "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And he said, "I will not let thee go except thou bless me." Jacob was desirous of having God's blessing. You remember before he left his home country area, before he fled to keep from being murdered by Esau, he made a pledge with God, or a vow. And he said to God, "If you will bless me in everything that I do, I will give you 1/10 or a tithe of everything that I ever get in my hands. I will give you a tithe of the gross of my earnings. Everything I get, before any withholdings are taken out, I'll give you a tithe of everything that I make." Now, he's back again begging God to bless him, as we see in verse 26. Verse 27 says, "And he said unto him, What is thy name?" God is asking him the question, "What's your name?" And Jacob replies, "It is Jacob." He said, "My name is Jacob." Verse 28, "And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel." Israel. Your name is going to be called Israel from now on. Why? Well, I think it's partially for the argument that I'm going to give you, because Jacob became the father, or was the father, and eventually had 12 sons who became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, or became the fathers of the 12 tribes, and the 12 tribes are known as Israel even today. Though we speak of them synonymously as Jews, yet they are Israel, because the Bible teaches that all the 12 tribes have come together. Even James tells us this in the little book bearing his name. When he writes an epistle, he says, "I'm writing this to the 12 tribes scattered abroad." Israel. They're not known as Benjamin or Levi, etc., but they're known as Israel. So he's changing his name from Jacob to Israel, as he tells us here in the middle of verse 28. "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." As a prince, you've been successful with me. I'm going to give you what you've asked for. Because he wrestled with God all night long. He said, "God, you got to bless me. God, if you don't bless me, I won't be blessed. I need to be blessed of you." And God says, "All right, I'm going to bless you." God had to bless him because God had already said he would bless him. Bless him in Abraham. And God had reaffirmed the Abrahamic covenant in Isaac, the father of Jacob and Esau. And now later on we're going to find that God is going to reaffirm the Abrahamic covenant in Jacob, and promise the same thing to Jacob that he promised to Isaac, that he originally promised to Abraham. So God's going to get ready to bless, because God is going to bring on the world scene a people who are not a people, or who were not a people. And God is going to do it through the loins of an old man by the name of Abraham. But now we've seen the progression down to this boy, Jacob. Now we move to verse 29, and Jacob asked him, talking to God, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." What's your name? Now there's been wrestling, been discussion, been in heated dialogue with an individual, evidently for several hours. And he says, "What's your name? I pray thee, tell me, what's your name?" And he said, "Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name?" Why are you asking my name for? Why are you interested in my name? And he blessed him there. God blessed him there. Evidently, God had some kind of a communication with Jacob that isn't recorded in Scripture, but God said, "I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless you like I've never blessed anybody else, and your posterity is going to be as the sand by the seashore. It's going to be as the stars of heaven, and everything that you desire, I'm going to give it to you." Why? Because God is going to bring a unique people on the world scene that we commonly refer to today as the Jews, and they are revolutionary individuals. There's nobody in the world like them. An Israelite always remains an Israelite. They have customs and they have routines in their lives that are completely different than the Gentile, and nobody can change them. You see, there is such a thing as a supernatural force behind an individual, behind a people, and it's behind the Israelitish people. They're different than ordinary people. No, I admit they're obnoxious sometimes. They have ways about them that rub us the wrong way, and they are scoundrels when it comes to making money. They can make $1 when we can't even make a penny. They just have something uniquely about them. So Jacob has gotten blessed, and we notice this here in the latter part of verse 29, and he blessed him there. Verse 30 says, "And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel." Peniel. What does Peniel mean? It means the face of God. Peniel, Hebrew word, he saw the face of God. He came face to face with God. Peniel. "For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." He got assurance from God. Now, as he goes on to meet his brother who was angry with him 20 years previously, evidently he has the assurance that everything is going to be all right, because he comes face to face with God, and God preserved him. And so he called the name of the place Peniel. Verse 31 says, "And as he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh." This phrase, "he halted upon his thigh," means that he limped on one leg. He must have had a socket out. He didn't have a chiropractor in those days, and he put up with it. Evidently went back into socket later on, but he limped on one leg. He halted on one leg. So it says there, he halted upon his thigh, limped upon his thigh or on his leg. Verse 32, "Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh, and the sinew that shrank." Not only was his thigh dislocated by the blow that God gave him in verse 25, but the sinew shrank. That flesh in that area of his body began to shrink. It shrank. The hip bone perhaps went back into place, and the sinew stayed shrunken enough to cause the limp of verse 31. So there we have the famous wrestling match of Jacob with God. And in the wrestling match, his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. Number 2, the fringe benefit. God said, "I'm going to bless you. I'm going to preserve your life. And I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to be with you." And that's rather interesting. Now we move into chapter 33, and we have the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau effected in verses 1 through 16, beginning in verse 1. "And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau. He sees Esau coming, and with him 400 men. Now this was the thing that bothered him. If my brother is friendly, my brother's not going to do me any harm, why is he bringing 400 men with him? He brought this many men to take vengeance as he had vowed in 27 verse 41. Because in 27:41, Esau was still mad at him. Esau was determined to go out there and kill his brother, even though 20 years had passed. Or was he coming to honor Jacob or to make a show of his own power? There's a number of arguments there. 1, he's coming to take vengeance. 2, he's coming to show a power thrust that he has. 3, he's coming to honor his brother. One of the 3. We'll see what happens. If vengeance was the motive, God changed his mind. Because if Esau was determined to go out there and wipe out his brother, steal his wives and his children, because they're very valuable slaves. Women and children can be so very valuable in that day and age, and even today. I remember on one occasion, on one of our tours, we had a young lady, a very pretty young lady, probably 25, maybe 30. And she was a very reckless type of girl. She went out late at night by herself. And we went to her and we said, listen, calling her by name, you can't do this over in this country. Because over here they'll steal white women. They'll steal young women. They'll steal any colored skinned woman they can get. If they're young women and they have put them into the prostitution mill and you can't ever find them again. And listen, lady, you don't want to do this. So you have to be careful in that part of the world. Because things over there are different there than what they are here. Very much different. But the thing that I get out of this lesson, though Esau was bringing 400 soldiers, if he did have vengeance in his heart, God changed his mind. Now that's the marvel of this little lesson right here at this point. God is over and above every circumstance. God can be the victor in every fight. God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. God has the ability to win under all circumstances, regardless of how much the odds may be against you. It doesn't matter. If you're on God's side, you'll win. So God is going to change the heart of this man Esau. So we notice here in the middle of verse 1, and with him 400 men, and he divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel and unto the 2 handmaids. This is Jacob dividing Leah and her children. You get in one group, and Rachel and your children, you get in one group and take your handmaid with you, and you take your handmaid, and they're separated by quite a distance. Because yet he doesn't really know that he is safe from Esau attacking him. So he's dividing up his family. So if Esau did come and take one family, he'd still have another family way over here. 2, 3, 4, 5 miles away. Whatever distance they had between them. The Bible doesn't say. I'm just speculating a little bit. Notice what it says in verse 2. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost. The handmaids and their children up in the front. Foremost. And Leah and her children afterwards. And Rachel and Joseph hindermost. Rachel and Joseph are way back there. Verse 3. And he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times. Now he's going to take the bull by the horns, and he's going to go right up to his brother Esau, and he's going to believe that God maybe is going to preserve his life. So he's going to go right up to his brother Esau, and he bows himself to the ground 7 times. That is a Mid-East custom. When you face royalty, or when you come to royalty, and I'm talking about Bible times now, not today, but Bible times, when you come to royalty, you bow down to the ground. If you're a commoner, you're a peon, you're just a Bedouin, you have nothing, you're just a a poor person, you bow down in front of the royalty 7 times. So this is what Jacob did to his brother. He bowed down 7 times according to verse 3 until he came near his brother. 4, and Esau ran to meet him. The bowing signified that Jacob was willing to honor his brother. He wasn't mad at him. He wasn't going to harm him. He was willing to honor his brother. Verse 4, and Esau ran to meet him. The enemy is coming to meet him. Jacob is bowing down. Esau is running to meet him in verse 4, and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Same thing happened to the prodigal son, if you remember, over in the gospel. When the prodigal son came back, the father ran out and he threw his arms around his long-lost son, and he kissed him, and he just stood there and held him close to his bosom, and he wept. Same thing happening now. 2 brothers separated for 20 years. A lot of water went under the bridge. Marriages, children. Both of them have become extremely wealthy. As you'll see in a moment, because God blessed one, God had to bless the other, because God said, I'm going to bless your posterity, speaking to Abraham, and I'm going to bless you like I've never blessed anybody else. Now, Jacob didn't know that Esau had been blessed, and Esau didn't know that Jacob had been blessed, but God knew the whole thing. So these 2 brothers come together, and they embrace each other, and they just stand there and they weep, and I'm imagining that it must have been 10 or 15 minutes before they got control of themselves. They got their composure back, and they wiped their eyes and they blew their nose, and before they could get back to normal. They were just glad to see each other. God worked a reconciliation. I know of a case like this where a man had an affair with an unwed girl, and she had a child. And the father of the unwed girl said to her, he said, I never want to see that man as long as I live. And the father wouldn't let the single girl marry the fellow who had fathered her child. I know this personally. It went on for about 10 or 15 years. And the father of the girl said, if I ever see him, I'll kill him. I don't want to ever see him. And the girl raised her baby, named it, and the baby took her name. And one day in a revival meeting, they both happened to be at the same church. It wasn't planned by the people. I'm sure if the 2 parties had known that they were both going to meet at a revival meeting, and it was a little schoolhouse, revival meeting, a little schoolhouse, and they both came to this revival meeting, and the result of that revival meeting, those 2 men met up front at the altar and threw their arms around each other, and they stood there and they cried and they hugged and they kissed and they forgave each other, and the hatchet was buried. God is able to work miracles, my friends, if we give Him the opportunity. Whatever the problem might be in your life, if there is a problem, I hope there isn't, but whatever problems might come into your life, just give God an opportunity to come in, and God can solve those problems. We can't solve them. We don't have the intellectual ability to solve them. We aren't equipped to do it, but God can solve them in His own due time. God will solve them. 2 brothers, mad at each other. One running for his life, the other chasing him. If I see him, I'll kill him. Gone for 20 years. At the end of 20 years, they meet in the middle of the road, and they hug and kiss each other and forgive each other. Marvelous, marvelous sight. Verse 5, and he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children. Esau raises up his eyes after this meeting with his brother Jacob, and he sees all of these women and all of these children, and he said, who are those with thee? Who are these people with thee? And he said, the children which God hath graciously given thy servant. These are my children. These are my wives. Verse 6, then the handmaidens came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves down to the ground, evidently 7 times. Verse 7, and Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. What a crowd. They're all bowing down in front of Esau. And he said in verse 8, what meanest thou by all this drove which I met? What do you mean by all of these cattle? All of these cattle, 200 she-goats and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts and 40 cows and 10 bulls and 20 she-asses and 10... What do you mean with all of this herd of animals? What's all of this about? Verse 8, the middle of it, and he said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. I'm making you a present. I'm going to give you a present. You're my brother. I've been gone for 20 years. I did you dirty 20 years ago. At least 20 years ago. I gypped you out of your inheritance. You remember? I tricked you. Our aging father, I made him think that I was you. And I made a mess of stew, and my mother lied to my father, and we tricked him. And I got your inheritance. And I'm sorry. I'm trying to make it right. I don't want any hard feelings among us. By this time, he's at least 90 years old. Jacob and Esau, they're old men. We don't want any hard feelings. We're getting near the end of the journey. Why should we be mad at each other? I want to give you a present. I'm doing this, the latter part of verse 8 says, to find grace in the sight of my Lord. Verse 9, and Esau said, I have enough, my brother. I have enough. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. You don't have to give me a present. I got plenty. God's also been blessing me. It's true. You got my birthright, but God's still blessing me. I've got plenty. I don't need anything that you're giving me. Verse 10, and Jacob said, nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. I want you to take something. For therefore I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, because I have enough. And he heard, and he urged him, and he took it. If someone offers you a present, take it. Don't say, well, I have 2 Rolls Royce in the garage now. I don't need a Maserati. Take it. Turn it into World Prophetic Ministry. We'll sell the thing. Don't be bashful. Someone gives you something. Some people, they can't take a gift. It just does something to them. It puts them in a bind. They want to pay you. They say, how much I owe you? Oh, I'll pay you back. I'll have you over for dinner. Or I'll do this for you. A present's a present. You don't have to pay anybody for a present. Someone walks up and gives you something, take it. So, after this big speech that Jacob made to Esau, it says here, and he urged him, the latter part of verse 11, and he took it. And he said, let us take our journey, and let us go, and I will go before thee. And he said unto him, my Lord knoweth that the children are tender, and the flocks and herds with young are with me. And if men should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. He's still worrying about his animals. He's a good herdsman. He's a good cattleman. So he doesn't want the hired men to run the animals too far in one day. So he wants to keep control of the situation. Verse 14, let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant, And I will lead on softly or slowly, it should be, according as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure until I come unto my Lord, unto Mount Seir. Mount Seir is in the land of Edom. Petra, the town, the city in the mountains that we talk about quite a bit in our prophetic teachings, was the capital of the Edomite kingdom, which is located in Mount Seir, in the mountains, the rose-red mountains of Edom, Mount Seir. So they're down there in the southern part of what is now the state of Israel, down below the Dead Sea in that desert area. And so they're on their way now up to Petra area, up to Mount Seir. So this is the story that we have here in the latter part of verse 14. And Esau said in verse 15, let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with me. I'll leave some of my folk here, and they'll show you how to get to our place. That's fair enough. And he said, what needeth it? Let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. What needeth it? Jacob was perhaps still distrustful of Esau, because here Esau wants to leave some of his men with him. Jacob still may have a little bit of doubt in his mind, a little bit of distrust. And so, because he himself had practiced distrust, you remember, he was very cunning and deceptive, and now was harassed by the fear of others, when in reality there was no cause. Someone has said that a thief will run when nobody chases, because the conscience makes you realize you've done something wrong and you run and hide when nobody's chasing you. So Jacob had this natural trait in his personality to be a conniver, and he gypped people out of different things, and so he never could be quite satisfied. He never could have that real wonderful peace down in his heart that everything was all right. At this point he hasn't. And that's why he says here, let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. Let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with thee. And he said, what needeth it? Why do you have to leave some of your folk with you? So Esau, verse 16, returned that day on his way unto Seir, Mount Seir, in the southern part of what is now the country of Jordan. We move to verse 17 through 20, and there we have Jacob settling in the land of Canaan. Beginning in 17, and Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built him an house, and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. Jacob built Succoth on the east of the Jordan, near the river Jabbok, which flows into Jordan from the east. So we find him now building some houses. Evidently he's going to settle down. And you notice he must have built some fencing or something for his cattle in order to control them, because they run away if he doesn't do something with them. Because it says in the middle of verse 17, and made booths for his cattle. Verse 18, and Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padeh Aram, and pitched his tent before the city. And he bought a parcel of field, where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Now it doesn't say what kind of money. We don't know the value of the money. We just know that he gave 100 pieces of money to a man, Hamor, for a piece of ground. How much? We don't know. And he erected there an altar and called it El Elohi. El Elohi, translated Israel. And what does it mean? It means the God of Israel. So now he's on the right track. He's come away from his uncle Laban down in the south country, where he's been for 20 years. Now he's brought his family north. He's met his brother, who he felt was angry with him. They have buried the hatchet. So evidently things are going to be all right. So now he gets back on the right track, and evidently he's going to build an altar, which he did in verse 20, and he's going to come back to God. And you know, that's a nice thing when we stray away from God. It's a very comforting thought if we come back to God. The tragic thing of all of the people who run away from God, a big percentage of them never come back to God. There's not so much disaster of running away from God if we come back. And though Jacob had run away from God, and during his interval of 20 years he had built a number of altars, and he had communed with God and been in contact with God, but now we find him, after all of his local domestic problems are solved, his family problems are resolved, now we find him building an altar, and he's going to get right with God and start living for God.
You have heard Dr. Howard C. Estep, president of World Prophetic Ministry Incorporated, present 2 more Bible study lectures from the book of Genesis, covering chapter 31, verse 30 through chapter 33, verse 20. For a continuation of the Genesis Bible study series, please listen to cassette number 16.